Welcome back, everyone. These are going to be our lectures from the St. Maximus the Confessor Institute, continuing the Basics of Biblical Hebrew series, Lecture 2 with Louis Dizon. Louis, how are you?
I am good.
It's good to have
So,
you back on and doing this like I've told you before. I really appreciate you doing this because
yeah,
learning basics of biblical Hebrew, that's going to be really helpful to a lot of
yeah,
folks. I appreciate you coming on and doing this.
yeah. I'm glad to be able to spread this knowledge around. And it's also helpful for myself because even though I've been doing this for a long time, it's good to like refresh on this material myself.
Oh yeah.
Because, you're never too advanced to do a refresher on the basics, right?
Oh yeah, yeah. Absolutely. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to turn it over to you. Take the lecture wherever you want to go with it, and if you have a PowerPoint, that you want to add, that's fine. I'll just add it on whenever you
Yeah.
prompt it on the
I,
screen. Do you
yeah,
want me
I'm
to
actually
keep it
just
on, by
use
the way?
Yeah, just this is fine.
Okay.
I'll be using Verbum for all of this stuff that we need to do.
So I'll just
So,
keep it on the screen, and you'll be on the corner, and I'll exit out. I'll be here listening, but it'll just be you in the PowerPoint.
yeah, great,
All
great.
right.
So, this is session 2. So, if you guys were around for session 1, we already covered the alphabet as well as the vowel markers, which are the basic building blocks for biblical Hebrew. So, you really ought to master writing the alphabet first before you try to do anything else. Um, and hopefully, those of you who are serious about trying to learn Hebrew have obtained the textbooks already. I will be going through workbook exercises as well as the actual grammar. That way, um, we could see what some of the important exercises are. So if you have the workbook that I suggested in the syllabus, then you will have seen that there are some writing exercises there. And if you bought the digital edition, you can always print it out. And this just shows you how to write out the letters of the Hebrew alphabet. So this is the square block script or a simplified version of it. And it helps to get the basic shapes down. So I don't know why the mem is like this. I don't ever write my mems like that. Mine's a little bit curvier, but be that as it may, this is a simplified version of each letter, including the final forms. And they also, oh, could have sworn the, um, oh yeah, actually, they do also have one for cursive Hebrew right here. So if you are interested in learning how to write cursive Hebrew, this workbook gives you the option of learning that, but that's totally optional. Like my Hebrew professor never taught us this, and I know that there are some people who are experts in biblical Hebrew who've never learned cursive Hebrew either. Um, Personally, I think it's helpful to know how to write cursive Hebrew. It helps you to write it faster. Plus, if you are doing modern Hebrew, they use a lot of cursive Hebrew in there. So one thing that I want to do, as long as we're on the workbook, is to take up a couple of the exercises. So here are some proper names, and these are only the consonants. So if you these look unfamiliar at first, but over time you'll learn to recognize them. It'll be easier when you're reading the actual biblical text because they have um, the vowel markers in them. So we'll go through them one by one. So this is Esther. So this Esther, and then the below that you have Obadiah. You would better know that in the Bible as Obadiah. And then you have some names that sometimes look very different from their English counterparts. For example, this is pronounced Yechzik-el or Yechezkel. And if that sounds unfamiliar to you, that's because this is Ezekiel. So the version of the name that we have in English is a simplified version that comes to us via Greek. This is David, um, which is of course David. So with David, there are actually two variant spellings of this. Sometimes it's spelled with a yod here. So this version does not have the yod. Instead, what you would do if you encounter it in the Bible is it would come with a hirek below the yod, and that will represent the I sound. You have Nehemiah, that's Nehemiah, and then here's an interesting one. Yerovam, this is Jeroboam. So a lot of names in English that begin with J actually begin with a yod in the original Hebrew. So Yerovam is one example of that. And then you have Mordecai, that's more or less the same as the English version. You have Devorah, and which is Deborah. Yishmael, which is Ishmael. You have Yaakov, which is Jacob. This is Avraham, which is, of course, Abraham. And then you have Yitzchak. This is one of my favorite Hebrew names to pronounce, Yitzchak. We don't ever combine those consonantal combinations in English because it sounds weird to us, which is why in all of the Indo-European languages, beginning with Greek and Latin, it becomes Isaac, which comes to us in English as Isaac. You have Yisrael, which of course is Israel. You have Rivka, which becomes in English Rebecca. You have Nebuchadnezzar, which is Nebuchadnezzar, of course. And then you have Yarden, which actually becomes Jordan in our language. So this one's slightly weird because it's pronounced with an A, yeah, but then it turns into an O sound when we transliterate it. And then you have Moshe, which is Moses. And you have Goliath. Goliath is, of course, Goliath. And then you have Esav. Esav is Esau. So those are some of the common names that you're familiar with if you've read the Bible. And now you know what they sound like in Hebrew. Another important exercise we need to take up is the one for vowel identification. So we covered vowels briefly, so this is just to familiarize yourself with it. So we need to identify three things. What is the name of the vowel? What sound does it make? And does the consonant have a dot? If so, is it a dagesh lene or a dagesh forte or a mapik? So the first few are done for us, so that'll give us an idea. So devir, so that comes with a vocal shva, which makes the abrupt sound. So the and the dagesh on there, that's a dagesh lene, and that just tells you that the consonant makes a hard D sound. So devir, so here you have achirek yod, which makes the long I sound. Up next, you have the word ma'akal. Ma'akal is the Hebrew word for food. So we have three vowel markers here. You have the patach, which is the horizontal line that makes the short A sound. Ma, so it makes ma. And then you have another one after it, ma'a. So if you recall, the shva can have another vowel, can have a vowel attached to it. So that's the composite shva, and that makes a very abrupt A sound, ma'akal. So, and then you have the comments, which is a long A sound. So both the patah and the kamets make an A sound, but one is a short A, one is a slightly longer A. The distinction tends to be blurred a little bit when we're actually reading it, but you should bear this in mind because sometimes you will run into words where the only difference between them is the difference between a patah and a kamets. And of course, you can imagine how that could cause some confusion for people who forget that distinction. And then you have the word motnaim. If I recall correctly, that's the word for loins. So you have a comet here, but instead of the usual long A, it makes a short O sound. So if you recall, I'm in the textbook, the comets can be either a long A or a short O. Um, that sounds confusing at first, but over time you learn to anticipate where each one is used. And then you have a shva here. That, of course, is the silent shva. So it is unpronounced. And its main function in this context is to indicate that it is the end of a syllable. So it's mot. And then the next syllable after it is na. So below the nun, you have a patach, which makes a short A sound. And of course, you'll see that there's this arrow on top of it. That is what we refer to as the accent marker. It tells you that you put the stress on that syllable. So normally in Hebrew, we stress the last syllable unless this thing appears, in which case we stress the syllable on which it appears. And then you have im. So this is what you call a chirek yod. So you have the yod, and then you have the dot at the bottom, which is called the chirek, and that makes a long I sound. If the chirek appears by itself, it's a short I. If it appears below a yod, then it is a long I. And then you have the word tevuah, which, if you know the root for that, has to do with bringing in. So it's sort of like produce, or like that which is brought in. So here you have etav with a dagesh lene, so that dot in the middle. So you'd make note of that here. And this is important because in ancient Hebrew, the tav can make a th sound or a t sound. If in modern Hebrew, it always makes a t sound. So if you're using modern Hebrew pronunciation, it'll always be pronounced t, regardless of whether the dagesh is there or not. And then you have a vocal shva, which again makes the sound. And then you have vu, vu. So this is a shurek vav. So remember, this is the letter vav, and if there is a dot in the middle of it, that's not a dagesh. That is the vowel marker for a long U, so called a shurek. So this makes a long U sound. And then finally you have a. So underneath the aleph, you have another kamets, which makes the long A sound. So this also gives you an idea of how these words are syllabified, which is something that will be being taken up shortly, because that is actually the next thing that we need to learn. But before we actually do that, I want to cover a little bit of pronunciation. So here we have the first 5 verses of Genesis. So I will read it shortly and try your best to follow along. If you're, hopefully the cursor will, you can follow the cursor at least so you know where we are. So here's the first 5 verses of Genesis. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. Ve'haaretz haita tohu vavohu v'choshek al pnei tehom. Ve'ruach Elohim merachefet al pnei hamayim. Vayomer Elohim, Yehi or, Vayehi or. Vayar Elohim et haor ki tov. Vayavdel Elohim ben haor uven hachoshech. Vayikra Elohim leor yom velachoshech kara laila. Vahi erev, vahi voker, yom echad. So if you listen to that closely, it will give you an idea of how each consonant and vowel is pronounced, and hopefully that will also give you an idea of how syllabication works, because that is what we're going to discuss next. And of course, this is something that will need to be learned in every language that you learn. If you ever paid attention in English grammar, you know that we have rules for how to properly syllabify words. So, for example, the word history here, we don't say history, instead we say history. Um, and the interesting thing is that many of the syllabication or syllabification rules that apply to English also apply to Hebrew. They're not exactly the same, but there is significant overlap. So the good news with this is that a lot of the syllabification rules should be pretty intuitive, and we'll see that shortly. So a couple of rules that you need to know. First of all, Hebrew syllables, generally speaking, begin with a consonant and have only one vowel. And these syllables generally come in two verbs. So you have, two forms rather. You have what you call an open syllable and a closed syllable. So a closed syllable has a consonant and then a vowel. All right. So we represent that with a C and V. And then you have the closed syllable, which is a consonant, a vowel, and a consonant, C, V, C. So you might be wondering at this point, what about words that begin with like an ah sound or an eh sound? For example, in Hebrew, the word for father is av. Doesn't that begin with a vowel? The answer is no, because if you recall, the letter aleph is also a consonant. So when you are doing Hebrew, remember that glottal stops are consonants as well. So when you are saying the word av, the first thing that occurs there is not the vowel a, but the glottal stop So here we have actually a word that has both an open and a closed syllable in it, and that is the word melech, which means king. So me, okay, you have the mem and the segol. And this is a closed open syllable because it ends with the e vowel. And then lek is a closed syllable because it ends with the k sound. So here, also the other thing that you need to note about these syllables is that they can be accented or unaccented. So accented basically means that we put the stress on it. And we already saw the arrow marker. That is one of the main ways that we indicate that a syllable is accented. A lot of words don't have this, so if you don't see one, generally speaking, we will put the accent on either the last syllable or the second to last syllable. So for example, the word davar, okay? So this is the word for word. So we put the stress on here, the second syllable, davar. It is not davar, I've actually heard people put this stress on the on the first syllable, um, and that is a very wrong thing to do. There's because there's no accent marker, you push the stress all the way at the end. So in this case, you have an open, unaccented syllable, da, and then you have a closed, accented syllable, var. And then here you have melek again. So me here is an open, accented syllable. Lek is a closed, unaccented syllable. So you can see here. Um, so you get open, accented, closed, unaccented, open, unaccented, and closed, accented. Those are the possible combinations that you'll get with syllables. Um, this is relatively like technical stuff. Like it does factor into some of the more advanced studies of grammar and syntax. Um, but you don't have to worry about this too much. And in any case, this sort of thing should eventually become second nature to you. Like I don't actively think about accents and open and closed syllables when I'm reciting Hebrew, and I don't think most people do. Um, Now, there are some exceptions to the rules that we mentioned before. So the only exception to the rule that every syllable starts with a consonant is the shurek vav. So the shurek vav only really occurs um, in a few very special cases, and it's almost always in the case of the word for end. Um, Later on, we will see some of the rules for putting a vav before a word because that is how we indicate the word end. And normally it's a vav with a shva underneath it, but sometimes it's a shurek vav. And it's usually before certain letters, such as the mem. So umelech. So here you have a word that begins with a long U sound. And of course, Ushmuel and Samuel, um, you have again a word that is beginning with the long U sound. So this is the only time, one of the only times that you'll ever have that you'll see a vowel beginning a syllable. And then you have something called and also the other exception is the furtive patach. Sorry, this is the exception at the beginning of a word. This is an exception that occurs at the end of a word. Um, and this is important to note because sometimes you will see a syllable, you'll see a vowel underneath a consonant where instead of pronouncing it after the consonant, you pronounce before it. So remember, um, normally the consonant comes first, but in this case, the um, order is reversed. And one of the most common examples of this that you'll run into is the word for spirit or ruach. So as you can see, the patach occurs underneath the chet, but you must resist the urge to pronounce this as rucha. That is wrong. Instead, it is ruach. And one of the ways that you know that it's furtive is that the uh, patach has been moved slightly to the right. See, it's not completely centered. It's underneath the chet's right leg, like that. And it almost always appears at the end of a word. Actually, it always appears at the end of a word. So if the patach occurs anywhere else other than the very last consonant, then it is after the consonant. So As you can see, a lot of it is very intuitive. And that's because most of this is the same as in Hebrew, sorry, the same as in English. There are a few places where the pronunciation might be different from what you'd expect. Um, and, and one of the examples that's given here is the word chokhmah. So chokhmah is the word for wisdom in Hebrew. Okay, so you can see that these are both closed syllables. You have two closed syllables here. Some people might think that there are three syllables here. They might try to say chokhmah or chachma, but it is not. So it's not three syllables, it's only two, and both syllables are closed. Yeah. And the good news about this is that they're fairly predictable. You don't know the rules for it yet, but you will, and over time, this will become second nature to you. So we've more or less got down the important um, rule, which is that every syllable begins with a consonant and has only one vowel. Okay? And one of the things that we need to make note of is that the use of the schwa does sometimes vary here. So it says here, you learn that the schwa after a short vowel is silent, after long vowels vocal. In a chapter, you'll see that these distinctions are actually related to syllabification. So a schwa at the end of a syllable silent. So you saw that at play here. So this is a silent schwa. If it was a vocal schwa, then this would be a syllable all on its own. So this is why you need to remember the rules for when a schwa is vocal and when it is silent. And also, let me see. The grammar, yeah. So really, the distinction between the vocal and the silent schwa is more for practical purposes, because technically a schwa is the same no matter what. We distinguish between them mostly because it makes it easier for pronunciation purposes. So the one other thing that needs to be noted here is, again, the dagesh. So you have the principle that closed unaccented syllables take short vowels has implications for the relationship between syllables and dagesh. So remember that there are two types of dagesh. You have the dagesh lenne and the dagesh forte, and this actually does to influence whether the syllabification somewhat. So one example of this is the word chite. Okay, so if you remember, dagesh forte indicates that the consonant is actually doubled. So if you see a tet and there is a dagesh on it, that means it's technically two tets that have been like sort of squished together into one. And if you unsquish them, it looks something like this. And once you unsquish them, you realize that what looks like an open syllable here is actually a closed syllable, because the first syllable is actually hit, and then the second syllable is te. So both of these are closed syllables. So you have two consonants in both cases and the vowel. If this was not if this did not have a dagesh, then this would be an open syllable. It would be hi, te. But because it is a closed, because it is a there's a dagesh, it becomes a closed syllable. It becomes hit, te, hit, te. And of course, this is also why I need to remember when it is a dagesh lene and when it is a dagesh forte. And the dagesh lene always occurs in the begad kefat letters. So you have bet, gimel, dalet, kaf, pe, and tav, and those will always take the lene, not the forte. So you don't make that mistake here. And then you have sometimes the dagesh forte actually disappearing. So there are certain letters which are indicated by the mnemonic skinem levi, which lose a dagesh where you might otherwise see them. And the most common example of that is vayehi. Okay, so if you remember when we were reading this passage, the word vayehi actually came up here a couple of times. It literally translates to "and it was." Okay, now the way we pronounce this is vayehi. Okay, so there are three syllables here, but there are three syllables here because there is an implicit doubling of the yod, which is not immediately obvious here because there should be a dagesh forte here, but it drops out as indicated here. If there was not a dagesh here, or there wasn't an implied dagesh here, you would pronounce this vai-hi, and some people do pronounce it that way, but it should be vayehi. Okay. It's a fairly minor distinction, and when you're reading it out loud, that distinction tends to get blurry. Like you might hear me say vaihi, um, it so it gets contracted to the point that you don't hear that middle syllable anymore. But for grammatical purposes, that middle syllable is still there. So a few other. There's a lot of rules here. So instead of going through all this, what I'll do is we'll head back here to this reading and we'll see some of these syllabification rules at work. So the first word in the Bible is the word Bereshit. Okay, so you'll notice there are three syllables here. So what I'll do is I'll enable draw on screen and I'll show you where the syllables are. So B, Re, Sheet. Okay, so you have three syllables. So this is an open unaccented syllable because there's only one consonant. You have re. So remember that the aleph does count as a consonant as well. So even though you say re, that sound means that this is a closed syllable. And then sheet. Okay, so this is a closed syllable as well because there you have a consonant both beginning and ending it. And also when we say bereshit, you'll notice that the accent is placed on that last syllable. So you have an open unaccented, closed unaccented, and then closed accented. And then bara. So again, you have open unaccented, and then you have closed accented because again the accent is here and there's a glottal stop at the end, so that is the ending consonant. And then Elohim. So Elohim. So you have, again, similar to this, you have, it begins with an open unaccented and then another open unaccented, and then you have a closed accented syllable. So that should give you an idea of how it works. So let's go down here. So you have the two instances of vaihi, va, that is an open unaccented syllable. Ya, vai, ya. So ya is another. Actually, this is, sorry, my bad. This is an open. So it's a closed unaccented syllable because the yod actually is part of that as well. But the yod is doubled, so the ya also forms its own syllable, which is open and unaccented. And then you have he, which is an open accented syllable. So this should give you an idea of how Hebrew is to be pronounced, and hopefully you got that down. So what I'll do is spend the remaining 15 minutes going through the first part of chapter 4 of this. So in summary, you should make note of this for chapter 3. Every syllable begins with a consonant and only has one vowel, and also closed unaccented syllables take short vowels. So those are two things that you'll need to remember there. And then we get to chapter 4. And I want to introduce you to the concept of triconsonantal roots. So one of the most important things that you'll need to know about how words are formed in Hebrew is that they have what are called triconsonantal roots. So this system actually is common across most Semitic languages. So to anyone who speaks, say, Aramaic or Arabic, you may already know about this. You would have basically three letters, and then those three letters form the basic skeleton on which you construct a variety of related words. So that is what we call the root. Okay, so one example of such a root is this. So you have the shin, mem, ayin. Okay, and of course we would pronounce this as shama. And this basic root has to do with hearing. So all of the hearing verbs that you will encounter in Hebrew will have this three consonants, and a lot of a lot of nouns and even names that have to do with hearing also have those three consonants as part of the root. So here are some examples. Shama, okay, he heard. And then mishma, the thing that is heard. So this is sort of a participle, which is something you'll learn way down the road. And then shema, which is report. And then you have hashmua, which is causing to hear. So you'll notice that in all of these words, that three consonant root is there, the shin, mem, ayin. And then we would have like other consonants like appended as sort of affixes to them, either a prefix or a suffix. And Shema is actually a very good example of it because it appears in one of the most famous verses in the Bible. So Deuteronomy 6 verse 4. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. So the very first word there is the Shema. And we refer to this as the Shema or the Shema Yisrael after that first word. As you can see, it's that same three consonant root So this is a word for hearing or listening, and you don't have to worry about this for now, but this is the imperative form of the verb. So it's like listen or hear. And this triconsonantal system also appears in names. So one of the best, there are actually two names in the Bible that have this particular triconsonantal root. Um, actually, does the other one actually? There's at least one that I can think of. So in Genesis 16:11, you have this. Vayomer la malach Adonai hincha hara vayolda vayolad ben vakarat shmo Yishmael ki shama Adonai el anyecha anyech. So you have the word Ishmael here. So those of you who know this passage in English, and the angel of the Lord said to her, behold, you are with child and shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has given heed to your affliction. The wordplay gets lost in English, but if you look at the Hebrew, okay, Vekarat shmo Yishmael ki shama Adonai el anyech. So Yishmael. So you can see that the name Yishmael has that triconsonantal root in it. The Shin Mem uh, Ayin is there, and then at the end you have El. So it's like literally Yishmael means um, God will hear. And then the angel completes the wordplay by saying, because Shama Adonai, because the Lord has heard your affliction. So there are a number of other examples of this. Actually, um, you'll eventually um, catch them as you learn more vocabulary. And it really helps to understand the significance of a lot of names that are in the Bible. Um, you can see that people don't just randomly pick names out of nowhere. There is significance to them. It usually has to do with the circumstances of that person's birth or something that was going on with the parents. So Ishmael, in this case, gets his name because um, God has heard Hagar's distress. So recognizing the triconsonantal root in the words you encounter allows you to make associations between words that are related in meaning so that you can build up your vocabulary. So once you get to the point where you memorize how different roots, what different roots mean, you can actually intuit new words as you run into them. It's like you run into a word that has the shin mem ayin root in it. Before you know anything else about that word, you already know that it has the connotation of hearing or listening. So even if you've never run into mishma before, you know that it is um, something that is heard simply because of the way it is constructed. Um, Actually, this concept does sort of have an English analog because we do build complex words out of simpler ones. Think of the example of the word cycle, okay? How many complex words in English have the word cycle on them? You have bicycle, you have tricycle, you have recycle, you have recycling, you have unicycle. So all of these words have cycle in them, but we add different prefixes and suffixes to them to add different layers of meaning, but they all have uh, the connotation of something to do with cycling. The main difference is that um, in English, these words tend to have a variable number of letters in them, whereas in Hebrew, the letter, there's almost always three consonants in the root. So actually, this is true of most Semitic languages. If although I know in Arabic there are four consonant roots as well. I don't recall off the top of my head having run into any four consonant roots in Hebrew. So I don't think that there are any in Hebrew. Although in theory it is possible because other Semitic languages have them. Um, there sometimes uh, something might appear to have two consonantal roots, but that's because one of the consonants in the root disappears. So one of the examples of this is the word rav, which is the word for much or many. And this comes from the root ravav, which is a verbal form that means to be much or to be many. So a lot of times when you have consonants repeating like this, you have two bits next to each other, they get collapsed into one. So that's what happens right here. In other instances, certain consonants tend to drop out. So one consonant that will frequently drop out would be a nun that appears at the beginning of the root. So the word natan, this is the word that means to give. Okay. You will sometimes see the word ten here, for example, here. So this is the imperative form of to give. So it's like give, or sometimes you'll see ten li, give it to me. And you'll notice that the nun that is supposed to be part of the root drops out. Sometimes the hey, if it occurs at the end, will also drop out. So, for example, the verb ra'a, to see. Once you write out the plural form of it, ra'u, they see, the hey drops out, and the vav, that is the normal marker for a third person plural, will take its place. And then if there is a vav or a yod in the middle of the root, that has a tendency to disappear as well. So the example given is seem, which is the verb for to put. And when we say he put, that disappears. It becomes sam, he put. So there will be a whole chapter down the road dedicated to explaining the rules governing these irregular roots. But it's good to make note of them now so that you know in advance that although Hebrew words normally have three consonantal roots, sometimes one or more of those consonants will drop out. So, as it says here, for now you must simply realize that whether you can see all the letters or not, a three consonant root is at the core of most words, and you should be able to make associations between the words you encounter in the text and the vocabulary that you already know. Speaking of vocabulary, now that we're in chapter 4, we will soon begin to do translation exercises. So you'll recall there is a workbook, and if you look at the table of contents, you have the grammar exercises, but you also have, in part 2, the beginning graded Hebrew reader. So there's a little introduction to the reader here. And it says here that it's designed to accompany chapters 4 through 23 of the textbook. And the beginning reader will cover what is called the Joseph sequence in the Bible. So chapters 37 through 50 of Genesis is the story of Joseph. And the nice thing about Genesis is that it has the simplest Hebrew in the whole Bible, alongside the books of Jonah and Ruth, which makes it very good for beginner exercises. And one of the things I appreciate about the Lexham workbook is that it gets you translating almost immediately. So once we get to the end of chapter 4, which God willing will be the next session, you will have the tools necessary to begin translating this passage. I mean, this one here, Joseph is hid by his brothers, which is Genesis 37, verses 1 through 17. For now, for those of you who have already acquired the textbook, try to make note of the vocabulary that occurs here. So um, these are the vocabulary items that you should know if you're going to translate this passage, as well as various grammatical forms that you should expect from the nouns. We haven't covered nouns yet, so this part is still, a little bit of a mystery to you. But once we cover nouns, you'll get it. It's just the different forms that a noun takes, whether it's singular or plural, masculine, feminine. We'll worry about that later. Also, hopefully, some of you are using Memrise. Memrise does give you the vocabulary of the Hebrew Bible in order of frequency, and that should hopefully tell you what vocabulary to prioritize if you want to like build up your vocabulary. Um, Hopefully, at the end of all of this, you'll have a vocabulary of about 700 words. So yeah, try to learn the vocabulary for chapter 4, and then once we've finished all of the grammatical items that are covered in chapter 4 next week, you should be ready to begin translating this. Now, with all that being done, does anyone have any questions?
Looking to see if there's any in the chat. Y'all go ahead and put them in there at Reason and Theology.
How are you finding this? Because there's a lot of technical stuff involved in learning a language, and it's easy to I don't know, lose track of what you're learning. So hopefully there wasn't anything that was unclear.
No, it's good. I'm not seeing any in the chat. Give you one more chance. Put it to at Reason and Theology so I can pick it out from the comments. Any questions?
This either means everyone understood perfectly or no one understood anything at all.
Here's one. Let's see. What is the application of the meaning of Abimelech's name?
Avimelech literally means my father is the king. So I do not, off the top of my head, remember that any significance is attached to that. Also, I just remembered there are actually two Abimelechs in the Bible. So the one that initially comes to mind, if I could actually resume screen share very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
There are two Abimelechs in the Bible. And there's the one in Genesis 20. That's the guy that Abraham lies to about his wife. And there doesn't appear to be any significance to his name. And then when you get to Judges, there's another Abimelech that comes up. So that's Abimelech, the son of Gideon. In this case, I think that his name has to do with the fact that he tries to make much of the fact that he is the son of a very important biblical figure named Gideon, and he also tries to establish a monarchy for himself, as the title for Judges 9 indicates here. So Avimelech here, his name does have some significance, um, in the sense that he tries to act like a king. He's not a proper king because the monarchy doesn't get established until First Samuel, but you have the beginnings of a monarchical tendency at play right here.
Mm. Looks like somebody repeated the same question as before, so I'm not seeing anything else.
Yeah.
So, yeah, looks like that's it for the questions. What do we have to look forward to for the next one?
Well, for the next chapter, so I mean, the next session, we'll cover the remainder of chapter 4, and hopefully, we'll get to chapter 5 as well. We're starting to stray a little bit from the lesson plan because the idea originally was to do chapter 3 exclusively, but as you can see, we also went into the first part of chapter 4. I always thought of the lesson plan more as a guideline than a strict rule anyway. So we should expect to get as far as chapter 5 next week. And again, for those of you who have the textbook and the workbook already, try to do the associated grammar exercises and translations after you finish reading each chapter.
Excellent. All right, Lewis, thank you so much for your time and for doing this. It's really invaluable, and I'm really grateful for you doing this.
All right, it's my pleasure.
All right. Well, we'll set up a date off the air for the next one. Everybody, thank y'all for watching and participating and asking your questions. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe. And also check us out, patreon.com/reason and theology. Till next time. God bless.